A lukewarm announcement that had initially raised hopes, but President Ramaphosa made sure to explain his mini reshuffle beforehand, and it appears only the resignation of former Home Affairs Minister Malusi Gigaba forced his hand into reshuffling, just months to that 2019 general elections. Political analysts Sipho Siepe, Dirk Kutze with me in studio, and Sanusha Naidu on Skype, as well as Cosatu's parliamentary coordinator Matthew Parks in Cape Town. Very warm welcome. Matthew Parks, so you all had a huddle at Cosatu with the President before this announcement, and is that all you could come up with?
I think as Cosatu we're quite pleased with the reshuffle. We don't expect a huge reshuffle 6 months before an election, but we're pleased that the President has filled vacancies. We couldn't afford to have critical posts like Home Affairs and Environmental Affairs without ministers who can be held accountable. We are pleased as Cosatu that he consulted with us beforehand, that we're moving away from a culture of 1 in the morning cabinet reshuffles where no one is consulted. But I think also most importantly as Cosatu, we're pleased that slowly the President is rebuilding a culture of integrity, of morality, of accountability to the public in cabinet, and we're moving away from a culture where you have rogue members of cabinet who show disdain for the public. So we welcome the reshuffle by the President.
I'm intrigued to know what you spoke about, though. I mean, what was the most pressing issue when it came to Cosatu's agenda? Cosatu's agenda.
I think for us was two things. One is that we wanted to see these vacancies being filled quickly and not to be left without ministers for too long. Mm-hmm. But I think also we raised our views quite sharply once again that we feel certain ministers who have lacked political credibility, such as Minister Batabile Dlamini, Minister Nomvula Mokonyane, we raised a point of view that they need to go. The President heard us. He was not able to accede to our demand yet. We also appreciate that this is not his cabinet in its entirety. He's basically leading a transitional government to take us towards elections in 6 months' time, that he couldn't make complete changes all at once, that there needs to be some stability in cabinet on the eve of the election. But also we recognize and we think it's important to acknowledge that he has removed 12 ministers who have been deeply compromised from cabinet since March this year. He has forced ministers who found themselves wanting politically to resign, and this is a good political culture that he's starting to bring to cabinet.
Well, Sipho, it seems that he's certainly got Cosatu on side now after that little chat earlier today.
Well, I like your question, that is this the best they can come up with? But what emerges is that Cosatu either is weak, is not able to make demands, and the demands that are consistent with what you get from the public. Because when you talk about a reshuffle, and this was not a reshuffle, this was just a filling of post. A reshuffle would mean that you look at both the subjective and objective factors. The objective factors would be how have the ministers performed. So you look at what the Auditor General has said about the ministers, what the Ministry of Planning, Monitoring and Evaluation had to say about the performance of ministers. And lastly, you would also say what is the society saying. So what you see here is that the President is fully aware that there are elections coming. And he's being consistent in saying, I'm a member of the ANC, and my first port of call is to the alliance. And the alliance is concerned that if you were to remove those ministers that have been identified, then all hell will break loose. So you see political expedience here. So you have the Cyril Ramaphosa that has been presented by the media, but you also have Cyril Ramaphosa, a political animal, who is fully aware that there are some ministers that you cannot touch because of the base that they have on the ground. But you also need those ministers as part of the troops that will be galvanizing the voters. So you have a president who is very careful. So the argument that is being presented to say, well, this is transitional, I don't think the voters might necessarily buy that. I think the president lost an opportunity also to start reducing, to show a direction. I mean, for instance, if you take...
sorry, let me bring in Dirk. I mean, do you think the public will buy this? I mean, it's a pretty weak message, isn't it?
Yes, and it is not, I don't think it can be accepted as a cabinet reshuffle. It is merely, as my colleague is saying, is filling some gaps, filling some vacancies. But luckily for President Ramaphosa, there was not a long period of expectation. It came sort of relatively unexpected. But we all knew that he had to fill the vacancies. But I think there is now an acceptance that he's only will be able to make any form of real change after the election. I think what is also for me striking is what the phrase that he used, that it must be representative of all sorts of things, of gender, of age, and I think what we are seeing, for example, in the case of Dr. Siyabonga Cwele, is that he's also taking into account, for example, provinces. He's from KwaZulu-Natal, Stella Ndabeni Abrams is from the Eastern Cape. She's formerly from the...
So he's throwing out the fishing rod, isn't he, and getting it with, talking about youth and, more women, bringing more women in and being more inclusive.
Yes, so I think it's more about what happens within the ANC at the moment than trying to build up a new government team of ministers.
Sanusha, what did you make of today's... can't really call it a reshuffle, can we? The gesture.
Yeah, I think he's putting it out there. He's actually saying to everyone that this is what I want as a ministry and a cabinet after next year's election. But here's the big gamble for him. That is, will he be able to pull it off in terms of keeping these two contested cabinet members in his cabinet? Where the expectation by opposition parties and by other analysts as well as colleagues as well is that he should have actually gone forward and played the card and gone in terms of either firing them from his cabinet, or how does he negotiate that? So I think what he's doing is that on the one hand he realizes that he is very constrained in terms of party politics and what's going on internally in the party, and whether or not he could go forward strategically maneuver it. So he's got a little space of flexibility, which he's very strategically trying to maneuver. But at the same time, these are the individuals who wield power, who have particular provinces that back them, and so he's testing the water. But here's the big gamble for him. This has to pay off for next year's election. So we know that party politics in South Africa is a very contested terrain. We know that the way the election works, and also the modern election is about voting for the party. Now he has to make sure that works in his favor. So what he has done is cast the net in the river or in the sea and basically try to test the waters. Now whether or not this pays off is a different dynamic that has to come out from the Thuli House, from the branches, from the NEC, and all the other dynamics. So if the new Home Affairs Minister is that level in which he wants to test the waters in KN versus Dlamini and so forth, and that faction, then it's going to be quite interesting. And here's the thing that really strikes me about all of this, and that is how much are we going to see this play out within the party list that come out for the election.
Okay, and as you're talking, we're looking at the picture of Stella Ndabeni there. I mean, you touched on it briefly. I mean, was that a clever move, appealing to the ANC Youth League, who feels that they've been pushed aside?
Yeah, first of all, one must also look at Stella. She's not a newcomer. No. She's been a deputy minister in communications. She's been a deputy minister in telecommunication. So it does make sense for the president to bring her in. This is also a natural progression to say young people can also progress to becoming ministers after having served their time.
Even though many young people in the party don't really believe in...
Well, it's something that I'm not too sure about whether there's been a study by the party members in terms of whether they support her, because I know that in at least the subcommittee of communication, she was one of the major players in the subcommittee. So it does make sense that the president will look at people's support on the ground and within the party, and if she's been very active, she'll be considered. But the issue that one must raise is the issue of this new dawn, because now the argument is being presented by the Cosatu to say the new dawn is postponed. It will take place after the elections. That right now, we're not going to start talking about efficiency, we're not talking about effectiveness, we're not talking about service delivery. What counts is to make sure that there's unity. So unity of the party and unity of allies is very important. Rather than, I mean, I'm disappointed with the Cosatu. I thought they were going to raise far bigger issues about there are some things you cannot postpone. But what you're also saying to the electorate is that have faith in me. I'll change in the future. And while they are going through hell right now. So you would want to have a leadership that says, if there has been something wrong in the past, you must be seen to be different from that. But what we are seeing here is more of the same. And also the concern that the EFF is raising, that you do also have ministers who have been ministers forever. The question is, and if you look at most democracies, you see people move in and move out so that you have new, fresh ideas. He had an opportunity as a fresh person to start coming on.
Let me throw that to Matthew Parks. I mean, what is your response to those accusations that Cosatu could have said and done more?
Yeah, look, it's neither here nor there what a few academics say. We were at the forefront of the campaign to remove the previous president, Zuma, when others were very quiet or singing his praises. We were amongst the first to defend the new president, Cyril Ramaphosa, when others were attacking him. We were amongst those who campaigned for him to be elected as president. I think we must also not have short memories. The president took office in March this year, or February, sorry, and he reshuffled half the cabinet. He removed 12 of the most compromised ministers in very difficult circumstances. We must not also forget that when he was elected president of the ANC at Nasrec,
I know, but I'm asking you about the sort of, the union not having more backbone here, not pushing him to make further changes. I mean, do you think that he will have more of an opportunity, he'll be more successful to make changes come the elections?
Look, he will definitely after the elections. And don't forget, Cosatu does not run cabinet. I think we must acknowledge that he has reshuffled half of the ministers within the past 6 months. We wouldn't want to see him like the previous president reshuffling cabinet every 5 days. That creates instability.
Okay.
He's done what he has to do.
Okay,
it takes time for ministers to find their feet. So
I'm going to bring in
managed it well.
I'm going to bring in a caller from Cape Town. Victor, go ahead. Hello, Victor. What's your question?
Hello, good day to you.
Good evening. Go ahead. We're listening to you.
I would like to, I want to congratulate President Cyril Ramaphosa on the reshuffle, but what I think is that in the past, that when 1994, President Mandela has set a good example of a mix of ministers from the opposition into his cabinet. And that made us very excited at the time. So I think into the future we should consider, like invited the DA leader, Masamani, to come with all his advice to the president and work with the president. But wouldn't it be better to have those ministers closer to him in order so that they can serve the broader public? Because in essence, the president is not the president of the ANC only, but he's the president of the country.
Okay, thank you, Victor. Dirk, would you like to respond?
Well, I think the idea of having a more inclusive form of government is something which some are proposing. There's even some books published on it to agitate for that idea. I think the main parties like the DA and the EFF will not be really attracted by that now because they feel they are close enough maybe to take a position of government themselves, and maybe in the form of a coalition. So that idea, I think, is not so appealing. I think what most parties will say is they first want to go into the election and see how much support they can mobilize. And once after the election the results are known, then the positioning can take place about where they fit into the bigger picture. For example, the EFF, I think, given the way in which they relate to the DA at metro level, will not be forthcoming in the near future to join.
Well, South Africa's never been very successful with any sort of coalitions, have they really?
Yes. So that option I don't think exists at the moment. So in that sense, there's lots of uncertainty about what is going to be the scenario or the different forms of scenarios after next year's election.
So, Nusha, how do you think political parties are viewing today's events? Do they feel heartened, possibly? Do they sniff a chink, see a weakness there?
I think, Jane, what you're seeing today is the reaction by political parties this afternoon to what people are calling a technical kind of approach to just filling two posts. I think they probably feel a shock in terms of the fact that they see a weakness within the ANC. Because what really we're talking about here is we're talking about two types of coalitions. We're talking about a coalition in terms of the election where the ANC is not in the majority at particular provincial levels and therefore have to start negotiating with other political parties. But there's also the internal dynamic of coalition within the ANC between the centre and the different branch and provincial structures and how that plays out. And I think this is perhaps where the dynamics of the internal issues and the fragmentation of the party is beginning to show, or has already shown, as we've seen in Nazareth, where the opposition parties feel they have a real shot at this. So they can really actually, take out a chunk of the ANC's chink, in a sense, and go for it in terms of where they want to position themselves and how they could constrain the ANC both in terms of its own internal dynamics and the weaknesses. And what is interesting here is that you've got a president who came to Nazareth, and he's got an administration that is really a very, very contested both in terms of the NEC as well as in terms of his administration. So when you look at Malusi Gigaba and how you played that out, he waited for Malusi to kind of do the long game, and then of course, things kind of maneuvered themselves and positioned themselves, and Malusi kind of was advised, you have to leave at some point. Whereas, is this what he's doing with Batabi Lamini? Is this what he's hoping to do with Nomula Mokonyane? In the cabinet.
Okay, hold on. Let me bring Sipho in here because you're also breaking up a little bit. I mean, how does he ever appease all of the factions within the ANC? If you look at the strength of those two women, and the sort of grip that they have of supporters, important electorate for the ANC, how's he going to manage all of that? And considering Gigaba's still on the NEC as well.
I think that's a very important consideration that he had actually put. And this is where I make a distinction between the president, who is a creation of the media, and the president, who is a political animal, and the president who understands that ultimately the ANC dictates. So the sooner we jettison this image that we've created about him and start seeing him as a political animal, then we'll be able to understand what he stands for. And also the other issue that the Cosatu guy was raising is fails to understand that there's also a message that you send. When you are consistent, people will start believing you. He's been going around sending a particular posture about the government that he leads. You can call it transitional, but what is important is you must also realize that most of the ministers have been recycled over from Mandela, from Mbeki to Zuma, now to Ramaphosa. So this notion of saying there might be major changes when the ANC dictates, it's simply what we'll see when it happens. But when you say your administration...
Is the system flawed then? I mean, does it need to be modernized in order to do your job better?
I think to some extent, because there's a very rigid sort of succession process within the ANC. You must either, first of all, to become a minister, you must be a deputy. In order to become a deputy, normally you must be a chairperson of a portfolio committee. So others who are not in those positions are simply not in the running to become a member of the executive. Tito Mbowene's appointment was quite an exception in terms of the succession planning almost that's taking place within the ANC. Also, they can't bring people from outside Parliament into. The Constitution allows only for 2 ministers who are not members of Parliament. I would have said that would have been an option if that limitation didn't exist, that you bring in persons who are not necessarily tied down into the internal politics of the ANC, but are sometimes more, let's say, technocrats or persons with specific expertise in a certain portfolio. At the moment, most ministers are not experts. They are expert politicians, but not necessarily expert in their portfolios. And I think that's the problem. There's therefore a limited pool for President Ramaphosa from which he can choose these new ministers if he wants.
And Matthew, what do you think the focus should now be heading to the elections, considering the high unemployment and all the economic issues that South Africa is facing?
Look, for us, the number one issue, both in the run-up to elections and even for the next administration afterwards, is about getting the economy moving, job creation, ending the economic recession, dealing with corruption, wasteful expenditure. We've got a clear plan in terms of the job summit agreements, the investment summit agreements, the stimulus package. We really want to see ministers now focusing on implementing those. We don't need any more discussions. We simply need to move the economy forward. Workers are being battered by the recession. We have 1 out of 3 workers unemployed. Thousands of workers are being retrenched, not just in the private sector, but now even in the public sector in terms of the state-owned enterprises. So we really need to see government now focusing on that as a number one priority, both before and after the elections.
All right, thank you very much for that. Matthew Parks, Sanusha Naidu, Sipho Dirk Kutsia, thank you. Still ahead, what's the role of black consciousness in this inclusive South Africa? We look at the philosophy today.